Welcome back to another Service Management Leadership Podcast with good friend David Cannon. We're talking about the basics of service management. Welcome back, David.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Good to be back. Always good to be with you.
David mentioned that this is one of my favorites, the CMDB, Configuration Management Database. We could talk about it in terms of process or the tool, whichever way you want to take this, David. But what are some ways that organizations can improve how they do configuration management, including the CMDB?
Thanks for asking, Jeffrey. I actually sat in your session in Vegas a couple of months ago at the Pink conference, and I have to say it was a brilliant presentation. I should be asking you these questions, but since you asked me, I have an opinion. I think one of the most important things about configuration management, to get this right, is to relook at the basic definition. I think we've kind of a lot of us have kind of gotten distracted by various definitions of what configuration management should be. So I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit, but this is what configuration management is. So configuration management is managing information that you need to know about the components that are used to deliver services.
Yeah.
And so it's if we look at the original definition of configuration management, there were only two rules about configuration management. The rules were only break it down to the level at which you manage it. Right. So if you're not going to manage something as an independent individual item, don't record it as a configuration item, because you're not managing it. It's not a controlled item. It's not, you may need to know about it. Record it as an attribute of something else, right? And the second rule was recognize that every group that is involved in managing that component will need different information about that component. So to get configuration management right, two things. One is understand which components are critical to deliver which services.
Yep.
You don't need to manage anything else. Right? You only need to manage the things that are important for delivering services, right? The rest,
right.
They may be embedded in those things, or they may be part of a third-party service or something else. What do you need to manage services effectively? And then secondly, recognize that the source of data to tell you how to manage those devices will probably be in many different places in the organization.
Yes.
So, you've got some groups that are, monitoring certain devices using SolarWinds. You've got other groups that are using another monitoring tool to monitor another environment. All of that information, they're managing those devices so they can support services. Logically, all of that data is really an extension of the configuration management database.
Yes.
So my second point is recognize the fact that a CMDB is not necessarily a single database that sits separately in the organization. I know we've kind of come to recognize it as that, because all of the tools that we use have this thing called the CMDB that sits in the middle. And one of the first things you do with that CMDB is import data into it. Well, but what's that? I mean, what you end up with in that case is you have duplicate data, which, by the way, will not be duplicate for long, because the operational tool is going to be changing a lot quicker than the copy of the data you have in the centralized database. And secondly, you're probably not using that data to actually manage the service. The people who are using the data to manage the service are the ones who are using the data in the operational tool. So one of the things that we really have to get better at is understanding where the useful data is and how we make it definitive. I was going to say how we control it. Of course, that's not the right word. But how do we make sure that it's definitive? How do we make sure that that is the source of data that we are going to depend on? That when someone calls the service desk and we want to check the status, for example, of a particular service, that we're getting real-time data about the status of those components, as opposed to the data, the status of that component when it was imported into the service desk tool. So one of the key things that we have to start building as part of our configuration management approach is a way of managing data across multiple sources. Oh, and of course, first thing is some people are going to say, but that's not what ITIL says. ITIL says configuration management database is a database. No, actually, it doesn't say that. It says it is a logical database, which means that a CMDB is more about the metadata than it is about the actual data. It's more about how you decide which data you're going to use and for what purpose you're going to use it. So we come back to the old thing of, if you want to manage configuration management effectively, you have to know what your services are. Then you have to be able to identify which components are used to support and manage those services. Then you have to identify which groups use that data and what they use it to do, so that you can keep track of how the status of that data changes and so on. You know, I do think there's value in having a centralized version of, or if you like, a snapshot of all of the data that is distributed around the organization. And certainly discovery tools will help you to get that. However, we should only use discovery tools once we have mapped what data we need. You know, there's nothing worse than buying a new incident management tool, incident change problem management tool, and seeing that it has a CMDB and it has this nifty little discover tool associated with it. And one of the first things we do after we buy the tool is turn on the discovery tool. Well, you'll be flooded with more data than you know what to do with. And just think about having the refresh rates of that data that you're going to need in order to keep, you know, a relatively current view of your environment. The overheads are just phenomenal. So it's much better to really do a proper and thorough service mapping exercise, service architecture exercise, and then figure out, if I'm going to manage these components, what do I need to know about them? And where am I going to find that data? And that is really the key to an effective configuration management function. Again, in my opinion, I know this is your favorite area, Jeffrey, and you've done a lot of research on this. So I'm going to hand this back to you. Your comments.
You anxious. So I think you mentioned in a previous one that we have to understand the value. We have to understand what it serves. And I would say that whatever data we keep and manage, we have to have for a purpose. And so how does finance, or the services that support finance, how do they use that data? And we have to have it in the context, in the content that they need it, right? None of this IT verbiage, but finance cares about what's the depreciation of these assets, or what's this and that, and how do we speak in their language? But you also mentioned something that I think is another true. You mentioned scope, you mentioned governance. Governance is another big one in there. But we also have to think, if there's 30 attributes in our CMDB, we don't need to use them all, because every one we keep up with takes resources away to something we really care about, right? And so that's important. But you mentioned discovery, and I have a story that I've told before, David, but I don't know if this is the first time you've heard it. When I took over as director of service management for internal for a large consultancy, and I took over, CMDB was one of the groups, Change, all those others, but they were on their 6th try of the CMDB. Try number 5, they did exactly like you said. They flipped on discovery, and this is a large organization, found millions of things that they didn't know what anything was, right? Because you flip it on, it finds it. And the CMDB is only as good as the relationships. So if you have no relationships, you really have no good CMDB. And it found everything. And my first thing was like, whoa, let's put a timeout on this. Let's figure out what our scope is, what our services are, and only discover the things that we care about. Then only the attributes. Let's put them together in services. Because if you find everything, it's going to be a mess. and you cannot, I mean, it's like counting the stars. There's nothing. And David, I tell that story, and that's 100% honest and true story of a large company, and every organization struggles in this way.
Yeah, and it's if you start the other way, well, what invariably happens in the kind of projects that you talked about is they realize that this is unsustainable. So what they do is they turn the discovery tool off, and they then spend a significant amount of time, at least 1 year in my experience, to get the CMDB in a reasonable shape. And then they turn it on again. Okay. That's a lot of time.
Right.
And it has very limited value because you've still got no guarantee that the data that you've identified as correct in your database is actually useful to anybody. Or it may be useful to one group, but does anybody else need it? And if so, what do they need it for, and how do we make it available to them? What level of currency is required? Is it okay that it's a month out of date, or does it have to be real time? These kind of questions. And it's far better, and again, in my opinion, to spend that time, if you have a year to fix the problem, rather spend that time understanding what does the architecture need to look like. And the best way to do that is start with the services. Like,
Yes.
what are people, what are people using? What devices need to be up and running for them to be able to use that service? And what do we need to know about those devices? And once you've defined that, you can configure the discovery tool to only go and find that information. But whatever we do, the people who design the auto discovery tools design it for the maximum case. They have to design it that so that any one of their 10,000 customers will find what they're looking for. And chances are you're only going to need an 1/8 or a 1/10 or a 100th of those things turned on. Exactly. So which 10th, which 100th are you going to turn? It's far better to spend that time beforehand. Not only do you get a better quality of CMDB, but you also get a better quality of service support, because now you know what all the dependencies are. You know how to configure your incident management process to work properly. You know how to check the dependencies of changes more effectively. So, it's an exercise that is a far better use of time and money than just trying to fix your CMDB after you've done an import.
Yes, and you can iterate. You don't have to solve it all the first time. And that's the part that I tell people is let's figure out how to do it well. We'll add scope from there. David, thank you for sharing your knowledge once again. Hopefully this 5-part series has been great for the audience. I've enjoyed talking shop with you, David.
Always. It's great. We often have these discussions. It's good to just turn the record button on and so everybody, this is what Jeffrey and I talk about when we get together.
Oh, yes. And we'll have to do this again. Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Bye, everyone.